On June 25, 2026, Governor Siminalayi Fubara walked a document into the very legislature that had spent 3 years trying to destroy him, and the Speaker had no choice but to receive it. Let that sit for a moment. This is the same assembly whose Speaker, Martin Amaewhule, on January 8th of this year, formally barred Fubara from presenting this exact document pending the outcome of impeachment proceedings. The same institution that initiated 3 separate removal attempts, the same body that adjourned without a return date in February, then went completely dark for 4 months, and then, without warning, it held an emergency plenary on June 25th. And the document it received was the 2026 to 2028 medium-term expenditure framework from the man it had legally prohibited from submitting one. The official story is that this is routine governance, a statutory obligation finally fulfilled, constitutional normalcy slowly restored. The documents, the timeline, and the political architecture underneath say something entirely different. This is not a budget story. It is a negotiation conducted through constitutional procedure, and the terms of that negotiation have not appeared in any official record. There is one question that this video will not answer until the very end. Who convened that emergency session, and what was received in exchange for opening that chamber door? Because here is what every Nigerian watching this crisis needs to understand. In Rivers State, every act of apparent constitutional compliance is a political move wearing procedural clothing, and the mask on this particular move is the most carefully constructed one Fubara has worn yet. Stay with me, because what is coming is exactly what the people behind this assembly calculated you would never piece together. Let's establish precisely what happened on June 25th, because the facts laid out in sequence do the unmasking on their own. The Rivers State House of Assembly convened an emergency sitting, its first plenary in over 4 months. Speaker Amaewhule read a letter from Governor Fubara transmitting the state's 2026 to 2028 medium-term expenditure framework, a statutory document that sets out government revenue projections, expenditure ceilings, and macroeconomic assumptions for the next 3 years. The House acknowledged receipt, then it deferred debate to a later date and adjourned. That is the visible sequence. Now, here is the sequence underneath it. The House last sat in February when it screened commissioner nominees forwarded by Fubara, rejecting 4 of them before adjourning indefinitely. Before that, it convened on January 8th to formally initiate impeachment proceedings against Fubara and his deputy Ngozi Odu, and then passed a resolution expressly barring the governor from presenting this very MTEF until those proceedings concluded. Then it failed to reconvene on its scheduled resumption date of February 15th, then silence for 4 months, then an emergency sitting to receive the document it had banned. Now ask yourself, what happens in a normal legislature? If an impeachment investigation is active, you don't open your chamber to receive a fiscal document from the subject of that investigation without resolving the investigation first, unless the investigation itself was never the point, unless the investigation was always a lever, a procedural weapon held in reserve to be applied or suspended based on political conditions entirely external to the proceedings. There is a historical pattern worth naming here. In 2023, when Fubara had only 4 loyal assembly members recognizing him as governor, he used that thin legal cover to pass a budget and commission infrastructure, keeping the machinery of governance visible while a constitutional battle raged in the courts. He did not wait for the crisis to resolve. He governed through the crisis, using constitutional acts to produce a public record that said, "This administration is functioning." What happened on June 25th is structurally identical. Different document, same logic, different political moment, but the same move. The structural concealment this triggers is the same one that has run through every chapter of the Rivers crisis since late 2023. The Amewule Assembly has never functioned as a legislative body. Its sessions, its adjournments, its resolutions, and its silences have all been calibrated to the strategic needs of a single external actor. When that assembly suddenly acts in a manner that serves the man it was built to remove, the question is never what changed inside the legislature. The question is what changed in the room where the legislature receives its instructions.
Let's go to the institutional mechanics, because this is where the legal ambiguity becomes a political weapon. Section 121 of the 1999 Constitution requires a governor to present appropriation bills and medium-term expenditure frameworks to the state legislature for consideration. The Constitution does not provide a mechanism by which the legislature can permanently bar the executive from fulfilling that obligation without triggering its own constitutional crisis. The January 8th resolution barring Fubara from submitting the MTEF was therefore legally dubious. It created a trap in which the governor was simultaneously obligated by the Constitution to submit the document and prohibited by a state assembly resolution from doing so. Who benefits from that ambiguity? The party that can control when it resolves. For 3 years, that party was Wike. Now look at what Fubara's June 25th submission actually achieves, because it operates on 3 registers simultaneously. First, he has created a documentary record, a letter transmitted to the Speaker acknowledged on the floor of a plenary session, establishing him as a governor actively fulfilling constitutional obligations. That record is not administratively important, it is legally important. In any future impeachment proceeding or court challenge, Fubara can now demonstrate that he attempted submission. The Assembly's January bar, by contrast, becomes a documented instance of legislative overreach. He has rebalanced the evidential ledger. Second, the optics of renewed executive-legislative engagement, regardless of what produced them, changed the public narrative around his governorship at the precise moment when the 2027 electoral cycle is hardening. Every day that governance appears frozen in Rivers State is a day Wike's preferred narrative that Fubara cannot govern gains ground. June 25th interrupts that narrative. Third, without the MTEF, the process leading to the 2027 appropriation bill was fully blocked. Without a 2027 budget, Fubara would enter an election year governing on executive fiat, a position his opponents were already preparing to weaponize. The MTEF submission reopens the budget cycle. It is the prerequisite for everything that comes next. Now look at the 2027 calculation embedded in this document. In the APC governorship primary process that concluded in May 2026, Fubara was pitted against Wike's loyaltists, specifically Dakorinama George and Kingsley Chinda. His own loyaltists were disqualified from the assembly primary screening. He subsequently withdrew from the governorship race entirely, citing peace and stability. Wike-aligned figures were cleared and positioned. That sequence would appear to be a decisive Wike victory. But here is what that framing misses. A governor who cannot pass a budget, cannot commission a legislative agenda, and is suspended in constitutional limbo between an active impeachment probe and a barred submission, that governor has no infrastructure for the one battle that matters after the governorship primary, the assembly seats. And Fubara is reported to have bought forms for 32 loyaltists to contest every single seat in the Rivers State House of Assembly. The MTEF submission is not a fiscal document. It is a foundation for an electoral war fought one constituency at a time. Consider the regional dimension. Fubara's ethnic base, the Ijaw bloc, had been growing increasingly restive at the perception that his son was being politically neutralized by an Ikwere-dominated machine operating through Wike's network. Ijaw leaders and youth groups openly condemned his withdrawal from the governorship race. Every act of governance Fubara produces in this environment is simultaneously a message to that constituency. I am still here. I am still governing. This is not finished. Now follow the money, the specific mechanism that makes all of this make structural sense. As part of the peace deal brokered by President Tinubu, Wike was reportedly granted nomination rights over all 23 local government chairpersons in Rivers State. Rivers State's oil-backed FAAC allocations mean that controlling 23 local government chairpersons is controlling the primary distribution architecture for billions of naira monthly at the grassroots level, the exact machinery that determines voter turnout, party mobilization, and electoral outcomes. That is the financial mechanism underneath this story. And the MTEF that Fubara just submitted will contain revenue and expenditure projections that interact directly with those LGA structures which he has no control over. One name keeps appearing across every financial and electoral mechanism connected to this story. The man whose grip on the LGA structure, the assembly, and the APC machinery in Rivers State is the architecture that the June 25th submission is designed to navigate around. We will get to exactly what that control actually costs and who is paying it. But here is what almost nobody has connected yet.
In December 2025, when Fubara defected from PDP to APC, all 6 states in the South-South geopolitical zone came under APC control for the first time. That is not a political footnote. That is a structural shift in Nigeria's federal geometry, and the June 25th development extends its implications in a direction that has not been publicly named. If Fubara can govern, produce a budget, commission projects, maintain legislative engagement within the APC structure without Wike's endorsement, then the South-South consolidation does not produce a monolithic bloc available to Abuja. It produces a fractured one in which the federal center must continuously manage competing sub-interests. That management has a price. Rivers gets infrastructure attention, federal project allocations, and presidential intervention in its crises, payments made by Abuja to maintain the stability of its most strategically valuable southern possession. The June 25th emergency session is, in part, a product of that federal calculation. For ordinary Rivers people, the stakes are concrete. Without MTEF approval, the process leading to the 2027 appropriation bill faces direct delays. In a state where governance was frozen for 6 months under emergency rule and contractors went unpaid, budget delays are not administrative inconveniences. They are disruptions to infrastructure procurement, social service delivery, and public sector employment in an economy that already absorbed the shock of the March-September 2025 suspension. The specific exposure is in the infrastructure pipeline, the airport bypass project Fubara flagged at his December APC declaration, the hospital commissionings in Rumuigbo, the 10 projects reportedly lined up. These are governance deliverables, but they are also 2027 campaign events. A blocked budget is a blocked election strategy. The security dimension is less visible but structurally serious. Rivers State's oil-producing communities sit in a political economy where LGA chairpersons function as patronage gatekeepers to creek communities, the same communities historically mobilized or demobilized through the networks that manage resource allocation at the grassroots. Wike's reported control of the 23 LGA chairpersonships, the patronage gateway to those communities, creates a specific vulnerability. If the political crisis escalates ahead of 2027 and that LGA machinery is activated against Fubara's assembly seat campaign, the pressure will not remain at the level of party politics. It will flow along the same channels that have historically connected Rivers' political competition to security conditions in the Niger Delta.
Now, the mechanism this analysis has held in reserve. The name that connects every thread, the MTEF submission, the emergency session, the withheld APC reception, the LGA chairmanship deal, the 3 impeachment attempts, and the opening of the chamber door on June 25th, is not Martin Amawele's own. Amawele is the instrument. The APC leadership withheld a formal reception for Fubara after his December 2025 defection because he lacked the backing of the man who retained control of the river's political structure. The June 25th session happened because something shifted in that control, not because it was relinquished, but because the Tinubu brokerage calculus required visible governance normalcy in rivers ahead of 2027. Permission was granted for the chamber to open. The MTEF was the visible price, and what Fubara paid in exchange, his continued absence from the 2027 governorship race, the acceptance of Wike-nominated LGA chairs, the February cabinet dissolution to accommodate Wike's allies in executive appointments, that remains the hidden cost that does not appear in any official record. There is one data point here worth sitting with. A governor who dissolves his own cabinet to accommodate his adversary's supporters, withdraws from the party primary under pressure, accepts the nomination of all LGA chairpersons by the man who tried to remove him, and then submits a budget framework to that man's legislature, is doing something that looks at a surface level like a series of concessions. Whether those concessions are purchasing survival or purchasing space for a longer game is the analytical question this video now puts directly on the table. In Nigerian federalism, when a state's executive submits to its legislative timetable rather than dictating it, the legislature is functioning as a legislative body. It is functioning as a negotiating table for a deal being written somewhere else.
Now, let's do something most political analysis in Nigeria refuses to do. Let's give the opposing position every advantage before we respond to it. Those who defend the Amawele Assembly's conduct and who see Wike's continued influence as legitimate are not arguing from a weak position. The February 2025 Supreme Court judgment did not adjudicate a personal dispute. It reinstated the pro-Wike faction as the legitimate Rivers Assembly, stopped federal allocations to the state, and nullified the local elections conducted by Fubara's administration. A Supreme Court ruling affirming the Assembly's legitimacy is the highest judicial determination available in Nigeria. The assembly that barred Fubara from submitting the MTEF was a constitutionally validated body making a procedural assertion in response to a governor they credibly allege was spending public funds without appropriation. Speaker Amawele cited specific allegations that Fubara was spending public funds without assembly approval, awarding contracts to loyalists, and refusing legislative oversight. The outgoing sole administrator was said to have left over 600 billion naira in the state treasury, a figure the assembly used as evidence that Fubara had been the source of fiscal irregularity, not its victim. If those allegations have financial documentation behind them, the January MTEF bar was not political suppression. It was a constitutionally mandated oversight body asserting its function. That is the strongest version of the opposing case. Now here is where it breaks. The Supreme Court was interpreting a factual record generated by one of the most politically compromised legislative environments in Nigerian history, a chamber that had been physically attacked, split into parallel bodies, and whose members had been engaged in defection maneuvers calibrated entirely to the removal of a sitting governor. A judicial ruling on legislative legitimacy in that environment is not insulated from the political context that generated the dispute. More critically, the 600 billion naira treasury figure has not appeared in any Auditor General's report, any FIRS return, or any independently verified public account. It appeared in a press briefing by the Speaker, who had previously coordinated 3 impeachment attempts. That evidential standard, the allegation of the accuser, unsupported by external documentation, is not a basis for barring a governor from fulfilling a constitutional obligation. Now, the data point this analysis is obligated to name, the one that does not support the argument I have been building.
There is credible reporting that Fubara's relationship with Tinubu and the APC soured not because of Wike's machinations, but because Fubara allegedly breached the reconciliation terms he had voluntarily agreed to, specifically attempting to sideline Wike after joining the APC and trying to secure the party structure for the 2027 governorship despite having accepted a condition not to contest. The APC screening committee disqualified his loyalists from assembly primaries. He was not formally received into the APC, unlike other defecting governors. He was told he could not contest under the party and reportedly left the screening venue in frustration before withdrawing. That sequence suggests the June 25th move may not represent Fubara outmaneuvering Wike. It may represent Fubara operating within the limits that Wike's network has already successfully established, limits that permitted the chamber to open but whose key remains in someone else's hand. This analysis takes that evidence seriously, and it still holds that the strategic significance of the June 25th submission is real, not because Fubara has escaped those limits, but because within them he has identified the one constitutional lever that forces legislative engagement without requiring explicit approval for each act of governance. The MTEF was not blocked, it was received. That is a measurable change in the operational environment regardless of who produced it. One misconception to correct before we move forward: this crisis is widely understood as a personal feud, a godfather and a godson who fell out over loyalty. That framing is the mask. Rotimi Amaichi said it plainly: the fight is about money sharing. What is actually being contested is the architecture of resource distribution in Nigeria's wealthiest oil state. Who controls the LGA chairman? Who controls the appropriation process? Who controls the party structure that will determine occupancy of the government house after 2027? The personal language, political sun, betrayal, weeping in quiet moments is performance. The structural competition for those distribution mechanisms is what lies underneath it. Tell me in the comments which version of this you believe. Is the June 25th MTEF submission the first move in a viable counter-strategy, a governor using constitutional compliance to rebuild ground from inside a losing position? Or is it the last move of a man who has already conceded the 2027 race and is governing as a lame duck, managing the appearance of authority while Wike's network manages the reality of it? Both readings are defensible, neither is obviously correct. If this is the level of analysis Rivers State deserves, hit the like button, not for this channel but as a signal to the algorithm that Nigerians are demanding this standard of political coverage.
Let's look at where this goes and what signals tell you which version of this story wins. The first and immediate move to watch: the Amesimi Assembly deferred MTEF debate. It did not reject the document. Deferral is a holding position. It preserves the ability to process the framework on terms that serve the Assembly's political requirements. Watch for conditions to be attached when debate eventually resumes. Demands that Fubara acknowledge prior budget infractions, drop Assembly-related court cases, or formally cede certain LGA appointment powers. Based on the February cabinet dissolution and the December APC defection, Fubara's established pattern is to absorb procedural cost in exchange for operational continuity. He is likely to comply with at least some of what comes next. The second move: the assembly seats. Fubara reportedly endorsed 32 loyalists to contest every constituency in the Rivers House of Assembly, including candidates positioned to challenge sitting Wike-aligned members. The governorship primary is decided, the assembly composition is not. If Fubara's candidates can take a significant number of seats in 2027, the political architecture Wike has spent 3 years constructing becomes structurally unsustainable from inside the legislature itself. Watch for Wike's network to move aggressively to screen, disqualify, or primary engineer those candidates out of contention before the general election cycle opens. The third signal: the NDC question. As recently as May 23rd, Fubara was publicly denying defection rumors to the Nigeria Democratic Congress, insisting he remains an APC member. The fact that those rumors exist and required a public denial from the governor's own communications office tells you that political actors in Rivers are already gaming post-APC scenarios. If the Assembly does not schedule a specific date for MTEF debate within the next 30 days, the NDC signals intensify, and a second party switch becomes rational if the APC cannot produce a functional legislative environment before the 2027 budget cycle must close. The specific thing to watch: does Amesimi's Assembly schedule a formal date for MTEF debate, or does it adjourn again into silence? One outcome signals a managed detente. The other signals that the June 25th was a performance of normalcy, not the beginning of it. Now, the question that opened this video: who convened that emergency session, and what was received in exchange for opening that chamber door? The session was called by the Amesimi Assembly technically on its own authority, but this body does not act on its own authority. 3 impeachment attempts abandoned mid-process, a sine-die adjournment followed by 4 months of complete silence, then a sudden emergency sitting to receive a document from the man it had formally barred. The instruction on June 25th was to receive the framework, acknowledge it formally, defer debate and adjourn, creating a public record of legislative engagement without resolving any of the underlying political conditions. In exchange, Fubara got documented constitutional compliance and the beginning of a budget cycle. It is the minimum available to both sides, which tells you that neither side has yet decided whether the war is over.
If this trajectory continues for 5 years, a South-South locked entirely under APC control, a legislative body functioning as a political instrument rather than an oversight body, a president managing competing strongmen rather than resolving the institutional dysfunction they produce, Nigeria does not drift toward authoritarianism in the sudden dramatic sense that the headlines would capture. It drifts toward it procedurally. The budget process becomes a negotiation between federal preference and local patronage networks. The legislature becomes a mechanism for political pressure rather than appropriation, and the governor, whichever governor, becomes an administrator serving the interests of whoever controls the distribution machinery at the grassroots, which in Rivers means whoever controls 23 LGA chairpersons and the billions in monthly allocation that flow through them. That is not a warning, that is a description of what Rivers State in June 2026 already is. Here is the question I want to leave in the comments. Fubara has survived emergency rule, 3 impeachment attempts, a forced party defection, a disqualification from his own party's governorship primary, and a cabinet dissolution designed to accommodate his adversaries' allies. At what point does survival become its own form of power, and at what point does it simply become evidence that the real decisions are being made by someone else? You now know something that the average Nigerian watching the evening news tonight does not know. They saw a budget submission. You see a negotiation conducted through constitutional procedure, a governor, a minister, a president, and a legislature maneuvering around a document that none of them are publicly discussing. The person beside you watching the same headlines is missing the architecture underneath the event. Get this analysis to them, not because this channel asked you to, but because someone watching Rivers State without this context is going to misread everything that happens between now and 2027. There is one thread this video opened that we have not resolved: the identity of the APC figure who controls the assembly scheduling, controls the LGA chairmanship nominations, and controls the party structure that Fubara entered but was never formally received by, and what that control means for who actually governs Rivers State after 2027. That is where we go next. Stay close. This is NAIJA Unmasked. The mask stays off. I will see you in the next one.